you remember I was talking about the Serb minority in Croatia of being 11 or 12%. And that area in Croatia is called Krajina. And the northern part of Bosnia is also called Bosanska Krajina. Krajina means border in Slavic. So if you think about Ukraine, it's the same word. And so in the case of Croatia and Bosnia, that was the military border between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And the Serbs were required to be military to defend Europe against the Ottomans. The neutrality of Yugoslavia, people I support who analyze the Ukraine case say these are places that are geopolitically must be neutral.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I've been wrestling for a while with the question of how to best approach the Yugoslav wars, and finally decided to ask someone who's not from the region, but studied it for decades. Today, I'm talking to Susan Woodward, a professor of political science at the City University of New York. Professor Woodward is the author of Balkan Tragedy: Chaos and Dissolution After the Cold War, and also the more recent work, The Ideology of Failed States, Why Intervention Fails. Today we want to discuss what happened in the 1990s and the legacy of the Balkan Wars. Professor Woodward, welcome.
Good morning, good evening, or wherever.
My morning, your evening. Thank you very
Yeah.
much for taking the time today. And you wrote for many years about the Balkans. You wrote about the way Yugoslavia fell apart. And one of the things that I always wanted to discuss is this process. You know, Yugoslavia was a functioning state after the Second World War under its long-term dictator leader, Josip Broz Tito. And then Tito dies, and Yugoslavia was very well integrated into the international world. It was a non-aligned state. It had friends on all sides. Tito's funeral was, in fact, visited by most heads of states and leaders at the time. I think it was 82. And then comes this breakup right when the Cold War ended, or after the end of the Cold War, and a very violent breakup. What were the internal and external factors, according to your research, that led to this?
Oh my goodness. Do you know how major a question that is? There's
I
no
know,
way.
I know.
Well, do you want to start with some more specific ones? It's interesting. You asked me before we started this. I think you said, let me see if I can say, why did it fall apart after Tito's death? And you've phrased it better just now, that it doesn't fall apart until the end of the Cold War. But I also wanted to emphasize that Tito died in 1980. And the beginning of the end of Yugoslavia is when the Slovene and Croatian leaderships in two of the federal units of Yugoslavia declare independence. And that's moving towards the end of 1989, but it's not until June 1990. So you can see all of a sudden it's 10 years. So the question is, what happens in those 10 years? And equally, I guess what you're saying, what is the role of the end of the Cold War? And so I guess I would have to start by saying I do a political economy analysis. And to me, what was really crucial about the 1980s is it begins in 1979 with what we call the global debt crisis. And Yugoslavia was actually the experiment for the International Monetary Fund of what came to be called standby stabilization agreements. So these were 3 years, and they were what we now call austerity policies to repay debt. And the reason I say Yugoslavia was an experiment, they began to apply these in lots of other places, especially in Latin America, but it was first in Yugoslavia. So during the 1980s, Yugoslavia is having to do policies to repay debt. And you have a context of a political system. So let's say that's part of the international story. And I could jump ahead to say by 1989, the very special relationship that the United States had with Yugoslavia had with the United States, which I can talk about, ends because the Americans say, oh, you don't matter to us anymore because your role in maintaining the safety of the southern flank of NATO doesn't matter anymore because that's ending. And so the kind of special support, including financial, that the United States was giving to Yugoslavia already starting in 1949 ends. And that had a psychological effect, I would say. But most important, it was almost the end of a period of real austerity for people. So that let's move domestically and say that Yugoslavia was over and over again ever more decentralized a political system, so that by the late 70s even, the leaders of the federal republics, they're like states in the United States, the leaders, and let me just interrupt to say, the federal system created after World War II was based on the right of national self-determination for all the people bringing together parts of the different empires to a federal system. And by then, and secondly, the decision making at the center was by consensus. So the combination of decentralization, where most policies are taken by the people in the federal republics, and the consensus among them at the center, made decision making very slow, very difficult, and then in the context of the 80s, quite onerous, I wouldn't say so, well, let me just say very difficult, because the inequalities among the regions, going from the most rich in the northwest of Slovenia to the very poorest in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Macedonia, created a big conflict over what we would call tax policies. That is to say, the Slovenes, especially, were angry at having to pay so many taxes through the federal government to support the redistributive development policies for the poor neighbors. So I can play out lots of scenarios, but you can see at the international level, the sort of dependence of the Yugoslavs on international aid and lending and American support economically on the one hand, and ever more difficult decisions on redistribution and taxation domestically in a political system, context of a political system where they all have to agree before they can have any policy, led over time to this decision by Slovenia and Croatia to leave.
So you would say Yugoslavia was internally deadlocked, and that led then to these unaddressed grievances, politically unaddressed grievances, then to the declaration of independence for Slovenia and then Croatia.
Well, I wouldn't go so far. I wouldn't say it was deadlocked. I would like to say it was took a long time. People disagreed a lot. So there was almost by the end a constitutional crisis about what kinds of decisions could be made. And secondly, I'm very concerned not to use the word grievances, because, grievances, that's what democracy is all about. And even though it was a one-party system, it was very more democratic in decision-making, what we call the workers' self-management system, which I can describe if you want. But it was, in terms of decision-making, it was really very democratic, meaning you had to get consensus, right? So there were always going to be disagreements over federal policy at the center. And yes, of course, it's true that when the austerity policies were making life very difficult for people, unemployment was getting very high, inflation was very high. Unemployment was what to me was most important, because it always existed, was hitting the middle class and the administrative class. So, members of the party and leaders of the party, their sons and daughters didn't have jobs. But also consumer goods, because the austerity policies of the IMF put limits on what could be imported. And their production at home was in Yugoslavia was so dependent on intermediate goods for local production that things like laundry soap couldn't be produced anymore because of the chemicals that they were importing. So people's material conditions were really getting worse and worse. So to use a general term, grievance easily could have been mistaken, and the argument that's often said that this is ethnic hatreds, ethnic grievances, which I disagree with entirely.
Thank you very much for setting that one straight. A good friend of mine from Kosovo, a Serb from Kosovo, once made the point. Look, the reason why this became so bloody is because these communities, they were not just living next to each other; they were literal neighbors, and that worked for 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 hundreds of years and until it stopped working. So the question is, why did it stop working? And then you have these ethnic hatred coming up and starting to turn against that. So this is a wonderful observation that and I didn't know about this. So the IMF and the external debt in that case of Yugoslavia, and I suppose Yugoslav debt was denominated in US dollars.
Of
And
course. And to
because
interrupt you, at the moment in 1979, not only why is the debt crisis, it's because Volcker raises the Federal Reserve, interest rates in the United States, up to like 28%. And everybody's holding dollars in their, well, the system, so I won't go. So that was actually what was mainly causing the debt crisis. And it was especially difficult for Yugoslavia. So I let you go back.
and so does the falling away of the Soviet sphere also have something to do with that? Because I also remember you talk about these intermediary goods, and when I was in Herzegovina 2 years ago, I was in this shed of this 80-year-old the grandfather of my friend, and I saw in that shed a Zastava car, which is of course a licensed version of a Fiat model, and on the other hand, there was a tractor, a big machine imported from Belarus. Because those were the sturdiest ones, and Yugoslavia was able to access both sides of the Cold War. Did the end of that and the falling away of the Soviet sphere also have something to do with these economic difficulties that then resulted?
I don't think so. I mean, but first of all, let's say not both sides, but three sides, because as you already said, Yugoslavia was a founding member of the non-alignment movement. And so it had, and I would like to sort of now, one of the things I'm going to say about Tito when we get to it is what's really important about Tito is the way in which he was able to manage Yugoslavia's international position. And one part of it was this balance among three spheres, economically and politically. And one part of the balance was exactly in trade, that they had arrangements with the East, the West, and the Third World in a non-alignment bloc, and they could take advantage of the best way to do it. But then and let me also add, just to give some flavor to this, if you had a Yugoslav passport, you could travel freely without a visa to more countries in the world than anyone else in the world. It was part of the international position that Tito had been able to negotiate and manufacture. But back to the Soviet Union, no, I think they're simultaneous. I think what Gorbachev is introducing starting in about 1985 in relation to the Eastern Europe was affecting Eastern Europe, but not so much Yugoslavia, except perhaps, as I had mentioned earlier when you talked about the end of the Cold War, the way in which the American policies change, and no longer is Yugoslavia in its special position with the US. So I guess in that sense, it's not directly from the Soviet case, but indirectly through American policies.
Can you talk a little bit more about the American policy? So on the one hand, we have the economic policies. Some of them, with the IMF policies, let's say those were austerity policies by design. The increase of the federal rate by Volcker, that one was certainly inspired domestically with little regard of what happens externally. But what were the other policies, and also including NATO policies, that you see having had a role to play?
Well, in 1948, June, the Stalin and the Eastern Bloc chose to expel Yugoslavia from the Eastern Bloc. There's a lot of debate about what the real causes were. For me, it was Tito's foreign policy in Greece and in Albania and Bulgaria that was most important. But there was also a dispute about agricultural policy. And whatever the causes, they lost all of those markets, all that support, both political and economic. And I can go on at length about what happened, but by January 1949, the American government decided that they were maybe getting a great opportunity to take advantage of a country that was going against the Soviet Union. And so they start with the policy called keeping Tito afloat. For the whole year of 1949, this policy slowly but surely moves with the Americans persuading countries in Western Europe, Belgium, the Netherlands, Britain, to start trading with Yugoslavia. Think about it, it was not so long after World War II. To trading with Yugoslavia to help them fund, give loans and all. The Americans were going to trade yet, but they would persuade their partners. By the end of 1948, they had persuaded the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to start letting Yugoslavia borrow from them. And from then on, the role of World Bank loans and International Monetary Fund loans was absolutely critical to maintaining Yugoslavia and its excellent economy, where, as everyone says, people were really living beyond their means because they do by borrowing. Then a part of this American policy, besides the economic component, was to say that to be honest with you, I've not spent time recently thinking about or learning about how the negotiations went, but the result was that Yugoslavia's military, and I'll say something about that, would defend NATO's southern flank. NATO had a southern flank where the idea that the Soviet Union would interfere in Western Europe would go through Yugoslavia into Italy. Its northern flank would go through Poland, what we're facing right now with Ukraine. And so this meant that part of what Yugoslavia had to do was committing to having a very sophisticated federal army that would be there to defend the country against any attack, but also NATO's flank. And then militarily, the Yugoslavs, with this decentralized system, also had territorial defense forces, which would be local. So we don't need to get into that at the moment. But so this was an exchange in terms of both supporting NATO and getting aid from the US. But you also asked me what role NATO plays later. Is that what you were?
Yes, like in the entire process, does NATO of the breakup, the process of the breakup, does NATO have a role to play? Let's say, well, beyond, of course, the bombing of Serbia in '99, but before that.
Not until the wars begin, and not even in the Croatian case. So once the war begins in Bosnia-Herzegovina, then NATO is deployed it had several policies, but deployed in support of the humanitarian intervention by the UN, which the UN Protection Forces, UNPROFOR, and supporting a number of ways, including eventually a no-fly zone and sanctions in the sea, in the Adriatic Sea. But you could only say that was in support of the humanitarian mission and the international negotiations that were going on, chaired by the United Nations and the European Union, to end the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It is true that once the Americans decide in July 1995, under President Clinton, to get involved in trying to end the wars that they've been trying to negotiate for 4 years. They then decide, with a man named Holbrooke, Richard Holbrooke, to threaten the Bosnian Serbs with bombing if they didn't negotiate. And now the problem is, of course, I didn't say of course, to me it was of course, is that the Bosnian Serbs were negotiating all along. The problem was trying to persuade the Bosnian Muslims, the Bosniaks, to come to the bargaining table. And so the NATO threat of bombing was a gift to get them to the bargaining table. But that then did lead to NATO bombing in 1995. And then the use of NATO power to bomb Serbia in order to end the Kosovo war is separate from the Bosnian war. But this use of air power, what the Americans call coercive diplomacy, which I have lots of arguments against. I don't think it works. But that's the only role that NATO was playing. Whereas the United Nations and the European Union were playing major roles.
Can you sorry, now I have two things that I want to ask, but maybe let me go back first, because what you said about Yugoslavia's role for NATO in the Cold War of guarding the southern flank is very interesting, because it's a parallel of what Finland was responsible to do for the Soviet Union. Finland was playing that role, and both of these states were neutral one or the other way. I mean, at least de facto of what they were doing as a buffer zone, but they were neutral for one side militarily, in a sense.
Yes. And Yugoslavia considered itself neutral.
Yeah. This is very interesting. Okay, then let's go back maybe to the role of the EU and the Europeans, of how they then intermixed with their role in the breakup of Yugoslavia. What is your assessment there?
Essential. Part of the problem with the European Union is that when Slovenia and Croatia declare independence and leave in June 1990, we are 6 months before what's called the Maastricht Treaty. So it's still the European community, it's not the European Union. And so this is a period of time when you need diplomatic assistance to prevent war in Yugoslavia over the breakup, and the Europeans themselves busy with their own change in who they were. And so, which is then the treaties of December of that year. However, in June and July, right after Slovenia and Croatia, I'm calling them by the name of their republics, and now they're actual states, declared independence. The Europeans decide to rush in and see if they can negotiate it. And so they become very involved diplomatically through that. It doesn't work, but that's another. And then, and I guess I should go on, in terms of the actual fighting in Bosnia, not in Croatia, but in Bosnia, the European Union is, along with the UN, trying to help negotiate an end for a long time, and had deployed the British and the French deployed lots of members of this UN protection force, and the negotiation right at the very beginning created something called the European Union Military Monitors, EUMM, and these were mostly, I think probably retired, but in military officers, intelligence people who were from European Union countries who were on the ground to write reports and send it back to Brussels.
And internally inside the one-party system, which, as you said, was way more democratic than one would think of an officially communist state, there were these strongman leaders. Of course, Mr. most famous or infamously, the Mr. Milosevic on the Serbian side, but also on the Croat side, very figures that people that were very or still disputed. I mean, Mr. Tuchman. What is your assessment about the role of these strongman leaders on all the different sides? It's because one narrative is they are, I mean, especially for the Croats, that this was Mr. Tudjman was a liberator of the Croats. On the other hand, there were very big problems in terms of war crimes, but within the war, but also with. Could you maybe assess his role in the process of the breaking apart?
Um, Franjo Tudjman had been a general in the Yugoslav army. And then he became a nationalist, working very hard with lots of Croatian emigres, mainly in the United States, but also in Australia, to make Croatia independent. So it was even before the Slovenes were saying, because the Slovenes, um, I argue, starting with the beginning of Yugoslavia after World War II, the federal system, under the vice president Edvard Kardel, had a plan already from the 1920s to use Yugoslavia as a staging ground for eventual independence. But they were doing it in a very careful way, and they were also very supportive of Yugoslavia in itself. For that reason, they wanted to do it peacefully, I think. And so their disputes with the federal government starting in the middle of the 1980s are slowly but surely dismantling the country. Whereas at Tudjman in Croatia was doing it on a nationalist ground and very right wing in terms of militia and well, I don't want to. My own view is that I should maybe what I'll tell you. Friends of mine in Slovenia were very angry with Tudjman from hijacking their strategy. That once Croatia tried, or Tudjman tried to be part of this movement for independence and declaring in a time when people knew that 11% of the population in Croatia were of the Serbian ethnicity and nationality, that this was going to be a problem that had to be negotiated. The Slovenes were really quite upset with this. And I do feel that way myself. I'm not saying whether I support what Slovenia is doing, but it is true that the right-wing nationalism and a lot of violence, um, uh, trying to think of what the term would be, is coming from Croatia. Now, Tudjman also was negotiating with Milosevic, who was the equivalent of president of Serbia, of the Republic of Serbia, that if Croatia would win, they could negotiate the boundaries of the new states. And Milosevic was in a position, I'm not quite sure if he ever believed it, but he did, in my own view, was mainly, whether one likes his tactics or not, wanting to keep Yugoslavia together. And then being forced by events to say, well, at least we'll keep Serbs together. And that meant supporting Serbs in Croatia and Serbs in Bosnia. And so, but there were periods in the 2 years before the war when Tudjman and Milosevic were negotiating about the borders, and probably part of the problem that many of us had at the time was the way in which Tudjman had decided that all of the areas in the western part of Bosnia, where Bosnian Croats lived, should belong to Croatia. So he would break up Bosnia-Herzegovina. So while Milosevic was supporting the fight of Bosnian Serbs for what they wanted within the country that would become Bosnia, he wasn't at the time doing something that would necessarily break up Bosnia-Herzegovina. We could say that in a sense he was just reacting to events rather than having a strategy, whereas Tudjman had a strategy.
Thank you for that. What's your assessment about this, about these two states that we have now, de jure and de facto, right? Bosnia-Herzegovina on the one hand, and Kosovo on the other hand. And Kosovo is, of course, disputed. Bosnia-Herzegovina is not like in international law, right? But when I was there, I got the feeling that the only thing that that these three major ethnicities agree upon is that they don't really want to be together, which is very sad. Um, uh,
Yeah.
what keeps it together is currently the consensus of the European Union that they have to remain together. And how do you see it? And also the Kosovo question.
Yeah. I mean, it's both the European Union and the United States,
Hmm.
because in many ways, the United States has been doing more interfering with changes on proposals, diplomatic proposals every couple of years to keep Bosnia-Herzegovina together. The EU is then given the task of implementing all of this stuff by the Americans. So I would blame the US more. At the moment, it's not looking so good. It's not really clear to me. I mean, the negotiations that Richard Holbrooke made at Dayton Accord to end the war by accepting that Bosnia would remain, all three pieces would remain together, including Bosnian Serbs, is a highly decentralized system that again has a very similar problems that we were talking about on Yugoslavia in the 1980s. But it also is that it divided Bosnia-Herzegovina between a Republika Srpska, the Serb Republic in the east, and the Federation of Croats and Bosniaks. So the Croats, even though they're now only about 7%, and they were about 15% of the population when the war ends, so it's a very small amount, they still feel that they didn't get there like a republic within Bosnia-Herzegovina. And so there's every once in a while there is a problem of the Bosnian Croats saying, but we want to leave. And so that adds a bit of a complication to these, what one could say is the insistence on the Bosnian Muslims, the Bosniaks, to keep Bosnia together. They are the majority and therefore they should have more power. And the Bosnian Serbs, who want the very decentralized system that the Dayton Accord created. And anytime the Americans come in supporting the Bosniaks to make the central government of Bosnia stronger, the Bosnian Serbs react. So it's going back and forth and back and forth. At the moment, it's not a very good situation. What keeps it together, it is said, and I don't know if I agree with this, it's because it's something that would be hard to demonstrate, is what's called the over-the-horizon force of NATO and the European Union. That should fighting start again, there's a commitment on NATO's part and the European Union to intervene immediately to stop the fighting. So the idea is people don't think of fighting because of that threat. I think that people just, why would they want to go back to war? But it is true that the constitutional issues, it's a stalemate, it's a ceasefire, it's not a peace agreement in the sense of something that could end it all. And who knows? I mean, it's now been 95 to 20, it's now been 30 years in November. Kosovo. It's
We can also skip it if it's, I mean, yeah, where even to start?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I think it's not clear to me when or if Kosovo will be admitted to the United Nations and therefore have international relations. That's the key. The current leadership of the Kosovo Albanians in Kosovo have not been very supportive of the municipal autonomy arrangements that have been given to the Serbs, especially in the north. So it's similar in a sense to the constitutional conflicts that I'm mentioning in Bosnia that goes back and forth and back and forth. And every once in a while, in this case, it's the European Union that's more involved. We have some negotiations that are not being implemented and it's at a stalemate. And my Serbian colleagues from Serbia proper, from Belgrade, think that for both President Vučić of Serbia and the leadership in Albanian leadership in Kosovo, that it's in their interest to keep it at a stalemate so that they don't have to be challenged. So who knows how long it's going to go on.
Yeah, the thing is these conflict dynamics then also tend to tend to empower certain people, and they gain from the conflict,
Yes.
and hence there's also on both sides an internal argument for keeping certain things in a certain way. Um, the strange thing to me is still that overall, this is clearly a region, linguistically, culturally, that geographically naturally belongs together, but that split into so many parts and belongs together. I don't mean necessarily as a nation state. I mean that of course there needs to be interconnection. Um, do you plus of course the issue that the Balkans are very highly important for the whole of Europe. I mean the First World War started right in Sarajevo.
Yeah.
You cannot write a history of Europe without the Balkans. Um,
Right.
what do you see at the moment as the structural role of the Balkans for the larger European theater of geopolitics?
I have a very dear colleague who's an historian of Southeast Europe. She's German. Her name is Marie-Janine Kollig, who writes wonderful books. And she has one of her books is about the Great Cauldron, which says you can't ignore the role of the Balkans in the history of all of Europe. It's a part of it, a lovely part of what you're saying. And I recommend that to your listeners to read. It's a wonderful book. And but I do think I'm not sure now at the current state of situation in the international system, or at least in Europe, where things are going. I mean, the role that the Trump administration is doing is changing, throwing things way up in the air. Who knows what's going to happen? I think particularly important for the Balkans is the Middle East, because the Turkey on the one hand, Saudi Arabia, Iran, they've always had a lot of interest and involvement during the wars, even in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Kosovo. So what would be the relationship between the instability that's going on right now in the Middle East and what happens in the Balkans, and vice versa? I think it's a moment where I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen, but we certainly don't see organizations who are taking advantage of what could be the stabilizing, integrating role of the Balkans. I don't know. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, I wish I had an idea.
no, I don't see one either. You know, there was this hope, especially I think in the early 2000s, that the Balkan situation could be resolved the way that the Irish question was resolved, basically through Europeanization, right? Integration into a larger political structure, and that will then heal the wounds. And by now,
Yeah,
this also seems highly unlikely to happen
yeah.
because of the fragmentation.
But no, but then I will say, here's the really important issue you've raised with the European Union, because Serbia, Macedonia, now called North Macedonia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina have all been waiting line, filling out the conditionalities to get in the European Union for how many? For more than 20 years now, and it's completely on hold. And so this idea that that was supposed to work is being held up by the European Union, particularly France. And who knows what it keeps changing in German, depending upon who's holds a majority in Germany. So I would like to think that they would see it in their interest to follow through on their own rhetoric that European Union integration is the key to stability in the Balkans and therefore stability in Europe. But that's not what their actual policies are these days.
No, not at all. But the European Union has so many problems at the moment that I don't think that this will be an area where they actually can help. Maybe a last thing. Do you think that the experience of the Yugoslav experience and the Balkan experience of this breakup, and also maybe with the the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and so on, that we have any kind of, is there any kind of hopeful aspects to what can be done, or how wars can be ended and the fighting can end, that can be somehow applied to the situation between Ukraine, Russia, NATO, the United States? Is there any parallel that you're seeing?
Not many. What I would say is, you remember I was talking about the Serb minority in Croatia of being 11 or 12%. And that area in Croatia is called Krajina. And the northern part of Bosnia is also called Bosanska Krajina. Krajina means border in Slavic. So if you think about Ukraine, it's the same word. And so in the case of Croatia and Bosnia, that was the military border between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And the Serbs were required to be military to defend Europe against the Ottomans. The neutrality of Yugoslavia, people I support who analyze the Ukraine case say these are places that are geopolitically must be neutral. And so if we don't think entirely about negotiating Ukraine in terms of neutrality, but then we're still not doing that in the former Yugoslavia, the US keeps playing games with it. So I don't know when that lesson will be learned, but I think not only that, but secondly, what was so special about Yugoslavia is this idea of it was really a consociational system where everybody had their rights according to their cultural and their language, but they lived together, and the political system could accommodate that. In many ways, Ukraine could have the same thing, although Minsk too seems to be an effort at that, and that was rejected. But we could still hope that perhaps that lesson from Yugoslavia, what did keep it, as you started our conversation with, what did keep Yugoslavia alive for more than 50 years, successfully, might still be applied to Ukraine.
That's what I'm trying to wrap my head around. Like there are these borderlands, as you said, and we have these cases all over Europe, everywhere, and actually Eurasia. Switzerland could have been. I mean, Bosnia is Switzerland. Switzerland is Bosnia for all intents and purposes. And it was the fact that in 1815 this neutrality was agreed upon and then was kept that allowed it to work as a
Yes.
buffer between the Austrians and the French. We have that all over the place. And then when you blow up neutrality, or not blow up neutrality, if political forces start to work that then work against this buffer idea, they create internal havoc, or through the internal havoc destroy the external function. I don't have a concept of it now. I
But
don't even know if
I
there's a
agree
question.
with you. I agree with you. Yeah.
So the question would be how to make this work internally in order to maintain the external function and vice versa.
I mean, my own experience with Yugoslavia is that um, whatever they can do internally doesn't work unless the external actors go along and support it. I think to me, they were more influential.
Unless they want it to work. And we see it in both cases, how external forces lost interest maybe in Yugoslavia and actually had different interests in Ukraine in working against the neutrality of Ukraine, in fact.
I mean, I'm an American, so I can speak about my country. And the Slovenia and Croatia were granted independence by Switzerland, Austria, to a certain extent, Norway, against the federal constitution of Yugoslavia. They broke it, right? But and the Americans didn't come along until many months later. So at the beginning, they knew what was the right thing. But why do I mention this? Because the Slovenes and the Croats were very, very clever in terms of the narrative they used to say why you should support our right to independent states and break up Yugoslavia. And that was anti-communism. So they figured out how to call Milosevic a communist, as if Tudjman and Kuchan in Slovenia weren't also members of the League of Communists. I mean, it's all the same thing. But they succeeded feeding into American anti-communism. And I know I have not a second moment would support anything that Putin is doing in his invasion in Ukraine. But American policy also is benefiting by anti-Russian narrative. So what we're saying is, if instead you could get a narrative of neutrality and peace and stability, I mean, it would have, that's where I think it has to happen. because then the ideas are always there, and people on the ground willing to play, I think, prefer them myself.
I think so too. I think so too. And this is a wonderful analysis, and I thank you for it. Susan, if people want to read your analysis, is there a place where you publish essays and so on, or where should people go to find you?
Oh no. I mean, I've just ended my I had my CV with all the documents on a website that there's a reason why it got taken down. And so I don't have it. I mean, they can write me, they can look at my CV on the Graduate Center of City University Political Science Department. It's there. Um, I write a lot.
And of course also buy your books because very good
Yes.
analysis.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I like that.
Susan Woodward, thank you very much for your time today.
You're welcome.